Your bedtime was once a matter of law. In the Middle Ages, legal codes governed everything from the fabric of your clothes to the behavior of your livestock, revealing a hidden social blueprint. By the end of this journey, you will see the deep architecture of power and fear that built the medieval world. We will uncover why societies put animals on trial and how a pair of shoes could challenge the entire social order. What does the most surprising rule from the past tell you about our own need for control today? This fragmented legal world produced rules that seem baffling to us today. But to the medieval mind, they were perfectly logical. The first law we will examine strikes at the very heart of their social order, a rule governing what you could wear. Across Europe, sumptuary laws dictated the fabrics, colors, and styles of clothing permitted to each social class. A peasant caught wearing silk or the vibrant red dye reserved for nobility could face a heavy fine. This was not merely about fashion, it was a visual enforcement of the feudal hierarchy. In a world without identification cards, your clothing was your public resume, a walking advertisement of your place in the rigid social structure. These laws prevented social climbing and maintained visible distinctions between the aristocracy, the merchant class, and the common laborer. They were a direct attempt to control economic spending and prevent the newly wealthy from blurring the lines of a God-given order. The anxiety behind these statutes reveals a society deeply fearful of instability, where even a pair of expensive shoes could be seen as a threat to the entire system. Why would a king care what a farmer wore? Because in a world built on status, the wrong color of cloth could unravel the illusion of natural, unchanging power. The same logic of control that dictated your clothing extended to the very hours of your day. When the evening bell tolled, every flame in the town had to be snuffed out. This was the curfew, the cover fire, a law that gave us the modern word curfew. In a landscape of tightly packed wooden houses and thatched roofs, a single unattended ember could erase an entire community by morning. But the fear of fire was only the surface reason. The curfew's true power was as a tool of social order. Once darkness fell, the streets were to be empty. This legal suppression of the night prevented the one thing every authority feared, the secret meeting. It stopped the spread of seditious ideas and the planning of revolts under the cloak of darkness. The law empowered the town watch to stop and question any soul found outside their home, turning the night into a territory under official surveillance. This was not just about safety, it was about silencing the shadows. The curfew enforced a rigid, communal rhythm of life where individual freedom was willingly traded for a promise of security. It reveals a world where the setting sun did not just bring natural darkness, but a state-imposed quiet, a collective holding of breath until the sun rose again. Why surrender your evening so completely? Because in the medieval mind, the cover of night was the perfect breeding ground for chaos, and the only way to control the people was to first control the night itself. That same obsession with legibility reached its peak with the legal codes governing personal appearance. Your entire identity could be read from the clothes on your back, a walking social document open for all to see. Medieval sumptuary laws were not simple fashion advice. They were elaborate legal codes that dictated every detail of attire, from the fabric to the color to the cut, all based strictly on your social rank and wealth. A common peasant caught wearing luxurious silk or a wealthy merchant's wife spotted in a cloak trimmed with ermine fur did not just face social disapproval. They could be hit with hefty fines, have the forbidden garment confiscated, or even face imprisonment. Why such a severe punishment for a choice of clothing? Because in this world, silk and ermine were not just materials, they were the exclusive symbols of the nobility, the visual shorthand for power and bloodline. These laws were a deliberate and constant reinforcement of the feudal hierarchy. In a society without photo identification or digital records, your clothing was your public resume. It told everyone you met exactly where you stood, from the highest duke to the lowest serf. The ruling class used these statutes to make the social order instantly recognizable and, they hoped, unchangeable. It was a powerful attempt to stop social climbers from blurring the lines. A newly rich merchant might have the gold to buy expensive cloth, but the law forbade him from wearing it. This was about more than controlling spending or preventing what was seen as wasteful extravagance. It was about fear. The established powers were terrified of a world where you could no longer tell a lord from a commoner at a single glance. If a farmer could dress like a knight, then what was the real value of a title? The entire illusion of a natural, God-given order began to fray at the edges. Your wardrobe was a public declaration of your place, and any attempt to dress above your station was treated as a direct threat to the power structure itself. This reveals a society utterly obsessed with control, using the law to stitch social hierarchy directly into the seams of every garment. But what happened when the evidence was unclear and human judgment faltered? The legal system turned to a higher power. In the absence of forensic science, medieval courts sometimes invoked a terrifying process known as trial by ordeal. A person accused of a crime might be forced to carry a red-hot iron for 3 paces, or to plunge their hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. Their hand was then immediately bandaged. After 3 days, the bandages were removed. If the wound was clean and healing, it was a sign of God's protection, proving their innocence. If the wound was festering and infected, God had judged them guilty. This practice, known in some regions by names like Brennhilde, was not seen as a primitive punishment, but as a sacred ritual. It was rooted in the absolute conviction that God was an active participant in daily life, and that he would not allow an innocent person to be unjustly condemned. The entire community would witness this event, and their shared faith in the outcome was what gave the verdict its power. This was a legal system that placed the burden of proof directly onto the body of the accused. It reveals a world where law and religion were completely intertwined, where the courtroom was a stage for the divine. The real judge was not the local lord, but God himself. This practice demonstrates a hidden social system held together by a common, unshakable belief. The community's trust in this divine intervention is what allowed justice to be served, and its verdict, whether for freedom or punishment, was accepted as absolute truth. Why would a society willingly subject its people to such a brutal test? Because in their worldview, the supernatural was not a distant concept, but an active force for maintaining order, and sometimes justice demanded a visible, physical miracle. Even the lowliest creatures were not safe from the long arm of medieval law. In courtrooms across Europe, pigs, rats, and locusts stood accused of crimes ranging from murder to theft. A sow that trampled a child, a colony of weevils that infested a grain silo, or a swarm of locusts that devoured a harvest could be formally charged, assigned a legal defender, and subjected to a full, meticulous trial. This was not a parody of justice. These proceedings were conducted with the utmost seriousness, following every legal protocol, with witnesses called and evidence meticulously presented before a judge. To our modern minds, this seems utterly absurd, a profound confusion of nature and jurisprudence, but for the medieval world, it was a perfectly logical extension of a divine order. They saw the entire natural world as a single, interconnected community, a creation of God where every being, human or animal, was subject to the same moral and spiritual laws. An animal that killed a person was not just a dangerous beast, it was a sinner that had violated the sacred order. By putting the creature on trial, the community was not just punishing an animal. They were correcting a cosmic imbalance, restoring harmony to a world thrown into chaos by the act. This practice also served a deeper, more human need. When a child was killed by a farm animal, or a year's food supply was wiped out by pests, the event was a senseless tragedy. The animal trial provided a structured, formal process to channel that collective grief and fear. It transformed a random, meaningless act of nature into a case of wrongdoing with a clear culprit and a path to resolution. The law became a tool for comprehending the incomprehensible, a way for a vulnerable society to impose narrative and control on a world full of cruel chaos. Why go to such elaborate lengths to prosecute a rodent? Because in a universe governed by divine law, even a pestilence had to be held accountable, and a community's sanity depended on finding a reason for the suffering they endured. But even justice could be suspended by a higher power. Throughout the medieval landscape, churches and consecrated ground functioned as legal force fields, known as the right of sanctuary. A fugitive, whether a petty thief or an accused murderer, could sprint for the holy doors and grasp the heavy iron ring of the sanctuary knocker, and in that moment they became untouchable to the authorities chasing them. This was not a loophole but a sacred law. Once inside, the fugitive was granted a stay of 40 days. During this time, they were protected from arrest and violence, fed by the church, and given a crucial breathing space to make an impossible choice. They could finally stand trial for their alleged crime, or they could choose to abjure the realm. Abjuration meant confessing their guilt and agreeing to leave the kingdom forever, marching barefoot to the nearest port under guard, never to return. This law was a profound expression of Christian mercy, a deliberate break on the swift and brutal engine of feudal justice. In a society where blood feuds and immediate vengeance were common, sanctuary acted as a vital pressure valve. It prevented a hot-tempered pursuit from turning into a cycle of retaliatory violence that could tear a community apart. It forced a pause, allowing cooler heads to prevail and offering a path, however narrow, away from the gallows. This practice reveals the hidden tension between two competing powers, the king and the church. By creating these islands of immunity, the church was asserting that its moral law, the law of God's forgiveness, could temporarily supersede the secular law of the land. It highlights a social system that, for all its brutality, still valued ritual and the possibility of redemption. The geography itself became a mediator of conflict, using sacred space to transform raw vengeance into a formalized, albeit stark, process of justice. The most essential ingredients of daily life, bread and ale, were never left to the whims of the market. In every medieval town, the assize of bread and ale dictated the exact price, weight, and quality of these two staples. A baker caught selling a loaf that was too light, or a brewer discovered watering down their ale, did not face a simple fine. They could be dragged to the public pillory and locked in its wooden frame, with the offending, underweight bread perhaps hung around their neck for all to scorn. For more persistent offenders, the ducking stool awaited, a humiliating public dunking in the local pond or river. This was not merely early consumer protection. It was the enforcement of a medieval moral economy, a deeply held belief that access to basic food and drink was a communal right. The law enforced what was known as the just price, a concept rooted in the idea that profiting excessively from another's hunger was a sin. In a world constantly threatened by poor harvests and famine, letting the price of bread soar was unthinkable. It was a direct ticket to riots and rebellion. So the authorities stepped in, fixing prices to ensure that even the poorest laborer could afford a loaf. This system reveals a society deeply suspicious of the free market and utterly committed to social stability above all else. Local guilds and town officials became the enforcers of this paternalistic order, their scales and measures serving as tools to guard against the greed that could unravel the entire community. Why would a government fix the price of a simple loaf? Because in the medieval world, bread was not just a commodity, it was the foundation of civil order, and a hungry populace was the greatest threat any ruler could face. Even your favorite game could be declared a crime. In the 14th century, King Edward III of England issued a royal decree banning the playing of football, calling it a useless and foolish game. This was not a minor regulation. It was a nationwide prohibition against a chaotic folk sport that bore little resemblance to the modern game. Medieval football was a sprawling, violent affair with hundreds of players from rival villages, a mass brawl with a ball that could last for hours and sprawl across miles of countryside. There were few rules, no limits on the number of players, and the goals were often the opposing village, church, or mill. The game was notorious for causing injuries, from broken limbs to fatalities, and for the immense property damage it left in its wake as the roaring tide of players surged through fields, trampling crops and smashing fences. So why would a king personally concern himself with a village ball game? The official reason was national security. The king's proclamation stated that football distracted able-bodied men from their vital practice of archery. In an age where the English longbow was the ultimate weapon, a skilled archer was a strategic national asset. The crown could not afford to have its potential soldiers wasting their energy on a chaotic melee when they should be honing the precise, disciplined skill that won battles. But the unofficial reason was just as important: the fear of the crowd itself. A gathering of hundreds of excitable, organized young men was a powder keg. It was a short step from a football scrum to a riot, or from a team of villagers to a rebellious mob. The law was a tool to suppress these large, unruly assemblies before they could ever challenge authority. This reveals a world where leisure was not a personal right, but a communal activity that the state could regulate or abolish entirely. Your free time was not your own. It was a resource to be managed for the crown's benefit, channeling popular energy into militarily useful pursuits like archery, while stamping out any pastime that fostered chaos over control. The beautiful game was, in the eyes of the law, a dangerous and subversive threat to the entire social order. While the state regulated public gatherings, the law reached even further into the home, targeting the most personal form of expression. A woman's voice could be legally silenced with the Scold's bridle, an iron muzzle and head cage designed for public humiliation. This was not a tool for common criminals, but a specific punishment for women accused of being nagwives or gossips, guilty of the crime of scolding. The device often featured a spiked bit that pressed down on the tongue, making speech not just forbidden but physically agonizing. A woman sentenced to where it would be paraded through the streets, led by a chain like an animal, her attempts to speak met with immediate, sharp pain. This was a legal sentence handed down by local courts, treating a sharp tongue as a public nuisance equivalent to theft. Why would a community go to such lengths to punish gossip? Because in this deeply patriarchal system, a woman speaking out of turn was not a minor annoyance. It was a direct challenge to the established hierarchy, where a husband's authority in his home was a miniature version of the king's authority over the realm. A wife who challenged her husband, or a woman who spread rumors that disrupted neighborhood peace, was seen as unraveling the very fabric of social order. The Scold's Bridle was the law's brutal answer, a stark monument to the fear of female speech. It weaponized humiliation to enforce silence and submission, transforming a person into a silent, walking lesson for others. This practice reveals a hidden social system where power was maintained not just through control of land or money, but through the control of language itself, proving that in the medieval world, the most dangerous weapon could be a woman's voice. A murdered Norman was a communal debt. In the stark years following the Norman conquest, a new and terrifying law took hold across England, the Murdrum Fine. This statute decreed that if a Norman was found slain and the killer was not swiftly identified and handed over for justice, a crushing financial penalty would be imposed on the entire hundred, the local administrative district where the body lay. The weight of the fine was immense, designed to cripple the community, making every neighbor, every farmer, every elder collectively responsible for the safety of their new masters. This was not a law for justice, but a law for control. The Murdrum Fine was a blunt instrument of colonial occupation, a legal cage designed to protect a tiny, foreign ruling class by holding the conquered Anglo-Saxon majority financially hostage for their security. Imagine the tension in a village when a Norman body was discovered. The immediate scramble was not just to find the truth, but to produce a culprit, any culprit, to avert the economic ruin that would befall every single person. The law engineered a society where suspicion was a survival instinct. It forced communities to become their own police, to monitor their own people, and to sacrifice any individual who threatened to bring the king's collective punishment down upon them all. This was a legal system weaponized to breed distrust and enforce compliance from within. Why would a king impose such a brutal, collective punishment? Because the Murdrum Fine reveals a hidden social system built not on shared values, but on ethnic stratification and sheer fear. The law was a constant, chilling reminder of the power dynamic. It told the conquered population that their lives were less valuable, that their community's welfare was conditional on the safety of their overlords. This legal code was engineered to protect a specific minority by making the majority collectively responsible, turning the very concept of community into a tool of its own suppression. Your daily bread was legally bound to your lord's mill. The feudal economy operated on a principle of enforced monopoly, where a lord held the exclusive legal right to hold markets and fairs within his domain. Any attempt by peasants or rival landowners to set up a competing market nearby was swiftly banned by law. This was not about fair competition, it was about absolute control. The peasants living on a manor were legally compelled to use their lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, and his brew house to make their ale. For each of these essential services, they paid a fee, a direct tax on their own sustenance that flowed straight into the lord's coffers. If a peasant was caught taking their wheat to a different mill or selling their goods at an unauthorized market, they faced severe punishment and heavy fines. This system, known as the banality of mills and ovens, was a cornerstone of the manorial economy. It reveals a hidden social system where economic freedom was an illusion. Peasants were bound to their lord not just by the land they worked, but by commercial chains. They were a captive customer base, legally obligated to enrich the very lord who ruled them. This legal stranglehold on local commerce prevented the natural emergence of a free market. It stopped peasants from seeking better prices or better services elsewhere, ensuring that wealth and power remained concentrated at the top. Why would a society outlaw something as simple as a rival market? Because these local monopolies were the financial engine of feudal power. The steady stream of manorial profits from milling and baking fees paid for the lord's knights, his castle, and his lavish lifestyle, reinforcing the economic foundation that propped up his political and social authority. The law was not designed for prosperity, but for preservation, using legal force to bind a community in economic dependency and prevent any challenge to the established order. The ultimate expression of a lord's power was said to reach into the marriage bed itself. We now confront the most controversial and debated of all medieval legal legends, the concept known as jus primi noctis, the right of the first night. This was the alleged custom where a feudal lord claimed the legal privilege to spend the wedding night with a serf's new bride before her husband could. Whether this law was ever widely practiced remains a fierce debate among historians, with many concluding it was more myth than common statute. But the legend itself is what matters, a dark story that refused to die, passed down through generations for a powerful reason. The very idea of such a law reveals a hidden social system built on a foundation of absolute power and profound humiliation. It served as the ultimate symbol of the Lord's dominion, a stark reminder that his authority extended beyond the fields and the courtroom, reaching into the most intimate and private moments of his subjects' lives. The serf did not truly own his own labor, his land, or even his own family. His body and the body of his bride were, in this brutal logic, ultimately possessions of the Lord. This alleged custom was the legal codification of sexual privilege for the aristocracy. It reinforced a hierarchy where the bodies of the lower classes were considered less valuable, their personal lives subject to the whims of their master. The enduring power of this legend, whether fact or frightening folktale, exposes the deep-seated anxieties of the peasant class. It speaks to a world where the fear of such abuse was so pervasive, so plausible, that it became woven into the very fabric of cultural memory. This was a form of social control that needed no written statute to be effective. The mere whisper of its possibility was enough to enforce submission, a chilling demonstration of how law and custom could be imagined to create a system of total control. Even your daily trip to the market was shadowed by the law's long reach. A merchant traveling to town with a cart full of grain could be intercepted before he ever reached the market square. A savvy buyer might meet him on the road, purchase his entire load at a slight discount, and then proceed to the market to sell the same grain at a steeply inflated price to the desperate townsfolk. This practice was not a clever business strategy. It was the serious crime of forestalling, and it was punished with heavy fines, time in the pillory, or even banishment. Forestalling was the act of buying up goods like grain, fish, or livestock before they reached the official market, deliberately creating an artificial scarcity. Two related crimes filled out this unholy trinity of market manipulation. The regrater operated inside the market, buying goods only to immediately resell them at a higher price without adding any value, while the engrosser went even further, attempting to corner the market by purchasing entire future harvests or massive quantities of a staple good. To the modern eye, these might look like the actions of a simple middleman or a futures trader, but in the medieval world, they were considered grave economic sins. The punishment was severe because the crime struck at the heart of the community's survival. These practices violated the foundational economic principle of the just price, a concept rooted in the belief that profiting from another's basic need for food was morally wrong. A loaf of bread or a bushel of wheat was not just a commodity, it was life itself. The law against forestalling reveals a hidden social system that viewed the entire economy as a moral endeavor, not merely a competitive free-for-all. It was a legal framework designed to prioritize fair access and stable prices for every community member over the profit motives of any single individual. The market was not seen as a neutral space for wealth accumulation, but as a vital organ of the community meant to serve the common good. Why would a society outlaw what we might call smart business? Because in a world always one bad harvest from famine, the volatility of greed was a threat to public order. The law sought to protect the collective from the chilling effect of speculation, ensuring that the basic mechanics of survival could not be manipulated for private gain. This was an economy with a conscience where the price of bread was a matter of justice, not just supply and demand. When words and witnesses failed, the law offered a final, brutal appeal to the heavens. Trial by combat, the judicial duel, was a legal mechanism where two disputing parties could settle a case by fighting, often to the death. This was not a common brawl, but a sacred ritual, a formal proceeding where God himself was believed to intervene, granting victory to the party whose cause was just. In a world without forensic science or reliable testimony, this was considered a valid, even holy, form of proof. The logic was simple and terrifying. If no human could discern the truth, then the ultimate arbiter would be divine will, made manifest through the strength of a man's arm. The entire process was steeped in solemn ceremony, with oaths sworn on relics and specific rules governing the weapons and the conduct of the fight. For the nobility, this practice was almost exclusively their privilege. A knight could not be expected to settle a land dispute or a charge of treason with mere documents and the testimony of peasants. His honor and his status were bound up in his martial skill. To have his fate decided by a judge's quiet deliberation was almost an insult. The judicial duel affirmed his identity as a warrior. It transformed a dry legal argument into a physical contest that tested his courage, his prowess, and his favor in the eyes of God. Winning a duel was not just about winning a case. It was public, spectacular proof of one's righteousness and one's place in the social order. This reveals a hidden system where law was deeply personal and deeply theatrical. Justice was not a quiet process of deliberation, but a dramatic, violent spectacle where truth was believed to be physically beaten into the open. The entire community became a witness to this divine intervention, their faith in the outcome cementing the verdict as absolute. Why would a society accept such a savage method? Because it perfectly merged their legal system with their spiritual beliefs and their warrior culture, creating a form of justice where the ultimate evidence was not a fact, but a miracle written in blood. The most dangerous transaction in the Middle Ages was not a sale, but a loan. The medieval church wielded a powerful weapon against the emerging world of finance, a strict ban on usury. This was not merely a restriction on high interest rates. It was a complete prohibition against charging any interest whatsoever on a loan of money. To the theologians of the time, money itself was considered barren, a sterile object that could not naturally reproduce. To demand more money in return for its use was to commit the sin of exploitation, a direct violation of the Christian principle of charity. A loan was meant to be an act of brotherly aid for a neighbor in distress, not a tool for profit. This religious doctrine created an immense and glaring vacuum in the economy. People still needed to borrow money for everything from funding a merchant's voyage to surviving a poor harvest, but pious Christians were legally and morally forbidden from filling this role. This impossible situation forced the vital, yet despised, practice of money lending into the hands of those outside the church's authority, primarily the Jewish population. Canon law did not bind them, and they had developed extensive networks of trade and finance across Europe. They stepped into this precarious economic niche, providing the essential service of credit that the entire society needed but its dominant religion condemned. This arrangement, however, created a devastating social trap. The Jewish money lender became a figure of both necessity and resentment. Kings and nobles were often their biggest clients, taking out massive loans to fund wars and building projects. Yet these same rulers could conveniently erase their debts by expelling the Jewish community or sanctioning violence against them. The moneylender occupied a paradoxical position, accumulating wealth through a practice everyone considered sinful, and thus becoming a ready-made scapegoat for every economic hardship. This reveals a hidden social system where economic reality was forced to contort itself around rigid religious doctrine. The ban on usury was a direct attack on the very idea of a commercial economy, an attempt to keep the feudal, land-based order intact by strangling the growth of mobile capital. It fostered a culture of deep, unresolved debt and dependency, where the solution was not a fair bankruptcy process but often a brutal pogrom. Why would a society outlaw the engine of its own economic growth? Because the medieval world viewed wealth not as something to be dynamically created through investment, but as a static pie to be divided, where one person's financial gain was always seen as another's spiritual loss. This religious suspicion of finance profoundly hindered the development of modern banking, keeping capital locked away and ensuring that the lifeblood of commerce flowed through shadowy, dangerous channels, forever marking the financier as both essential and eternally damned. Your own neighbor's crime could become your legal emergency in an instant. The hue and cry was a law that transformed every able-bodied man into a temporary sheriff. If you witnessed a theft, an assault, or a murder, you were legally obligated to drop whatever you were doing, raise a loud shout to alert the entire village, and immediately join the pursuit of the criminal. The entire community was then expected to take up the chase, a roaring human net closing in on the offender. This was not a suggestion, it was a binding legal duty. Failure to participate when you heard the call could result in the entire town or 100 being fined, a collective punishment for a collective failure. This system reveals a hidden world without professional police, where public safety was a personal, immediate burden placed on the shoulders of every man. Law enforcement was a communal reflex, a duty shared by all. The hue and cry wove a tight web of mutual obligation and constant, informal surveillance. You were legally bound to be your neighbor's keeper, and your neighbor was bound to be yours. This fostered a powerful sense of shared identity and communal liability. Your safety depended on their vigilance, and their safety depended on yours. But this system came with a dark underside, the immense pressure to conform and participate. When the alarm was raised, there was no room for hesitation or private doubt. To hold back was to mark yourself as an outsider, or worse, a possible accomplice. The hue and cry demonstrates how medieval society leveraged social bonds and sheer peer pressure as its primary tools of order. It created a world where the boundary between private citizen and law enforcement officer was completely erased. Your responsibility for the peace did not end at your property line. It extended to the entire community, making public safety a deeply personal and inescapable duty for all. A woman brewing ale in her own home was not just a cottage industry. It was a legal affair overseen by the stern eyes of her neighbors. The Leet Court, a local manorial assembly, held the power to regulate the vital trade of the alewife. These were typically women who brewed and sold ale from their homes, a common and essential role in a world where clean water was scarce and ale was the daily drink for everyone, from children to laborers. The court would appoint official tasters, known as ale conners, to test the quality and strength of each new batch. If an alewife was found selling a weak, watered-down, or spoiled product, she did not face a simple warning. The law prescribed public shaming. She could be fined repeatedly or sentenced to the ducking stool, a humiliating public dunking in the village pond that served as both punishment and a stark warning to others. This system reveals a fascinating duality in the medieval social fabric. On one hand, it granted women a rare, legally recognized economic niche. An alewife could operate her own small business, earning an independent income in a society that otherwise offered women few such opportunities. Yet this role was heavily supervised and constrained by the male-dominated institutions of the community. Her work was permitted, but it was never truly her own. The law framed her trade not as a private enterprise, but as a public service, a matter of communal health and morality that required constant vigilance. Why would a local court care so deeply about the strength of a single brew? Because ale was more than a beverage, it was liquid sustenance. A bad batch could sicken a village, and a reputation for weak ale could undermine the trust that held the local economy together. The regulation of alewives shows us the law operating at its most intimate level, reaching directly into the hearth and home to manage the most mundane details of daily life. It was a paternalistic system that supported women's work only so long as it conformed to strict communal standards, proving that even in a woman's own kitchen, her craft was never beyond the law's reach. A king could outlaw a game, but the true fear lay in the skill it might teach. Beyond the ban on football, some regions enacted an even more targeted law, explicitly prohibiting peasants from learning or practicing the art of archery. This was not about public order, it was about battlefield supremacy. The authorities actively promoted alternative pastimes like stoolball, an early ancestor of cricket, which was seen as a harmless diversion that built no dangerous martial skill. The logic was chillingly clear. In the hands of a trained commoner, the longbow and the crossbow became the great equalizers of medieval warfare. A single, well-placed arrow from a peasant's bow could punch through the finest plate armor and unhorse a noble knight who had trained for war since childhood. This weaponry threatened to dismantle the entire mythology of the warrior aristocracy, a class whose identity and power were built on the idea that their military prowess was both innate and exclusive. The law was a direct attempt to control the means of violence itself. It reveals a feudal paradox that tore at the very foundations of the system. In times of war, kings desperately needed a mass army of skilled archers to defend the realm or conquer new lands. Yet in times of peace, that same armed and trained populace represented the single greatest threat to the established order. The ruling class lived with the constant anxiety that the very men who won their battles could one day turn their bows against their masters. So the law stepped in to resolve this tension by deliberately enforcing a state of military inferiority on the common people. It ensured that the ultimate power to kill and to govern remained the exclusive domain of the elite, a monopoly protected not just by castle walls but by the statute books. Why disarm the very people you relied on for defense? Because the medieval aristocracy understood that a peasant with a bow was not just a soldier, he was a political statement, a walking challenge to the idea that power belonged only to those born with a title. A storm-battered ship on the horizon was not a call for rescue, but a signal for opportunity. The law of wreck granted the local coastal lord a terrifying right, the legal claim over every broken vessel, its precious cargo, and even the survivors washed ashore. In practice, this often meant that shipwrecked sailors and passengers, instead of finding refuge, could be captured and enslaved, or worse, murdered to prevent them from ever challenging the lord's ownership of the salvaged goods. This was not piracy, but a brutal form of property law, codifying the coastline as a zone of legalized plunder. For isolated manors with poor soil and little trade, a single good wreck could represent more wealth than a decade of farming. The law created a perverse incentive where the prayers of drowning sailors were met with the hopeful anticipation of men waiting on the beach. It reveals a social system where community bonds ended at the water's edge, and any stranger was considered outside the protection of any shared morality. Royal authority was often too distant to intervene, leaving local lords to act as petty kings over their stretches of shore, their power measured by what the sea coughed up. This legal framework turned coastal villages into communities of predators, their economy and status dependent on the misfortune of others. It draws a stark line between the medieval concept of law and our modern idea of justice. Why would a society legally sanction such brutality? Because the law of wreck exposes a world where resources were so scarce and royal power so fragmented that survival often meant viewing your fellow human not as a person, but as a potential asset or a liability to be eliminated. The line between a salvager and a pirate was not one of action, but of jurisdiction, a chilling reminder that law can sometimes be the most organized form of violence. Even your shoes could betray your social standing. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a bizarre fashion trend swept through the courts of England and France: shoes with absurdly long, pointed toes known as krakows or poulaines. These shoes were not a simple style choice, they were a walking social statement, and the law took notice. Royal statutes specifically decreed that the length of the shoe's exaggerated point must correspond directly to the wearer's social rank. A common laborer might be permitted a point of only 6 inches, while a gentleman could stretch to a foot, and a prince could stride with points extending 2 feet or more from his toes. This was not a suggestion, it was a legally enforced dress code for the feet. The reasoning was twofold. On the surface, there was a practical concern. These shoes were comically impractical for manual labor or even for walking normally, often requiring the points to be tied back to the shin with chains just to prevent tripping. The church also condemned them as indecent, their phallic shape seen as a public display of vulgarity. But the deeper motivation was the same anxiety that governed the color of your cloak. The aristocracy needed a way to make their superiority visible at a single glance, even from the ground up. A peasant with shoes as long as a lord's was not just following a trend, he was committing a visual act of rebellion, blurring the sacred lines of the social order. This law reveals a system of control so meticulous, so all-encompassing, that it sought to legislate the very shape of a person's footwear. Every step you took was meant to be a constant, public reminder of your designated place, proving that in the medieval world, not even your toes were free from the weight of the law. The tithing system wove a legal net that caught every man and boy over the age of 12. You were not just an individual, you were a member of a group of 10 or 12 men, a tithing, bound together by a powerful legal principle called frank pledge. This was not a voluntary association, it was a compulsory fellowship of mutual responsibility. The law dictated that you were legally accountable for the good behavior of every other man in your group. If one member of your tithing stole a chicken or got into a brawl, the entire group was obligated to drag him before the court, fail to produce him for justice, and every last one of you would face a collective fine. This system transformed your neighbors into your legal keepers, and you into theirs. It created a self-policing community where the primary incentive for law and order was not a fear of the sheriff, but a fear of letting down and financially burdening the men you lived and worked beside every single day. This reveals a hidden social architecture designed to enforce conformity from the inside out. The state did not need a vast, expensive police force when it could deputize the entire male population through the mechanism of peer pressure and shared financial liability. Your tithing was your first and most immediate court. It fostered a culture of constant, low-level surveillance, where noticing a neighbor's suspicious behavior was not just being nosy, it was a financial necessity. Why would a society force every man to be his brother's legal guarantor? Because frank pledge illustrates a world where individual liberty was a distant second to communal stability. The law used the very fabric of social bonds, the trust between neighbors, as the primary glue for public order. It was a system that recognized the most powerful enforcer is not the authority figure from afar, but the disappointed gaze of the men who know you best. Even the invisible world was not beyond the law's reach. Long before the frenzy of the great witch trials, medieval courts were already building the legal architecture to prosecute sorcery and witchcraft, treating it not as superstition but as the serious crime of heresy. An accusation could stem from almost any misfortune. A neighbor's cow sickened, a child fell ill, or a harvest failed. In a world without science to explain such events, the law offered a terrifyingly simple answer: maleficium, the act of harmful magic. But this was more than just blaming a spell for bad luck. The legal charge was one of conspiring with demonic forces, a spiritual treason that made the accused an enemy of both God and the community. The punishment for a convicted, which was the ultimate purifying fire, death at the stake, a sentence designed to eradicate the sin completely from the earthly realm. This collaboration between church and state created a powerful mechanism for policing not just actions, but beliefs themselves. The laws against sorcery reveal a hidden social system where any unexplained suffering could be legally reframed as a deliberate act of evil. This provided a structured, official channel for a community's deepest anxieties. When plague struck or famine loomed, the legal framework was already in place to identify a culprit, to transform random tragedy into a narrative with a clear villain and a path to resolution. The system overwhelmingly targeted those already on the margins, particularly women who lived alone, healed with herbs, or simply failed to conform to social norms. These individuals became the designated scapegoats, their prosecutions a brutal form of social hygiene that purged the community of its fears by destroying a human symbol of them. Why would a society write laws against an invisible crime? Because the witchcraft statutes show us the law being used as a tool for ultimate control, not merely over bodies, but over the very story of why bad things happen. It turned personal grievance and communal panic into a cosmic battle, with the courtroom serving as the battlefield where divine justice would smite the devil's allies. This was a legal system that sought to burn its uncertainties away, proving that the most terrifying laws are often those written to combat the shadows in the human heart. Your social standing was measured by the weapons you were legally required to own. The Assize of Arms transformed every free man from a simple subject into a designated soldier, his financial worth calculated not just in coin, but in the sharpened steel he could bring to the battlefield. This was not a voluntary militia. It was a nationwide conscription system written into law, mandating that every man, based on his wealth, must possess and maintain specific military gear. The poorest freeman had to keep at least a spear and a padded gambeson, a basic jacket of layered cloth. A wealthier farmer or tradesman was expected to supply a sword, a helmet, and a mail shirt. At the very top, a knight's obligation was immense: a full suit of plate armor, multiple war horses, and an entire arsenal of weaponry. This legal code created a hidden social system where your bank balance and your battlefield role were one and the same. It directly wove military obligation into the fabric of the feudal economy, reinforcing the social hierarchy in the most practical way imaginable. Why would a king trust his kingdom's defense to a makeshift army of farmers and shopkeepers? Because a standing professional army was prohibitively expensive for most medieval states, the Assize of Arms was a brilliant, cost-effective solution. It outsourced the enormous expense of equipping an army directly onto the citizens, making military readiness a universal civic duty. The law effectively blurred the line between soldier and civilian, creating a society that was always partially mobilized for war. This was a kingdom perpetually prepared for conflict, its defense resting on the legal requirement that every free man was, first and foremost, a part-time warrior. The Assize reveals a world where the state's security depended on legally mandating the participation of its people, organizing the entire free male population into a class-based reserve army, ready to be summoned by the Crown's command. Your economic future was locked behind a guarded door. To practice a skilled trade in a medieval town, you needed more than talent or ambition. You needed a legal license from a guild, a corporate body that held a complete monopoly over its craft. These were not mere clubs for artisans. They were legally empowered institutions, chartered by the crown or local lord, with the absolute authority to decide who could work, what they could make, and how much they could charge. The path to mastery was a long, legally defined ladder. It began with a contract of apprenticeship, binding a young boy to a master for 7 years or more. During this time, he lived in the master's household, receiving no wages, only food, lodging, and instruction. This was not considered child labor, but a form of legal adoption into the trade's family. After successfully completing his term, the apprentice became a journeyman, legally free to work for wages from any master in the trade. But the ultimate goal, the key to economic independence, was to become a master. This required the journeyman to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work judged flawless by the guild's masters, and often the payment of substantial fees. This legal structure created a hidden social system where your right to earn a living was not an individual right, but a corporate privilege granted only by your membership in an exclusive club. The guild's most fiercely protected asset was its trade secrets, the formula for a vibrant dye, the technique for tempering a specific steel, the intricate steps to assemble a complex clock. Revealing these methods to an outsider was not just a betrayal, it was a serious legal offense punishable by heavy fines, permanent expulsion from the guild, and effectively the end of your career. Why would a society legally enforce such secrecy? Because a guild's monopoly was its lifeblood. By hoarding knowledge, the guild ensured that the demand for its members' unique skills remained high, protecting their prices and their prestige. This system created remarkable stability and produced goods of exceptionally high quality, as masters were deeply invested in maintaining their craft's reputation. But this corporate control came at a steep cost. It stifled innovation, punishing those who deviated from approved methods. It severely limited economic mobility, often making mastership an unaffordable dream for poor but talented journeymen. The law had created a world where knowledge was not meant to be free, but was instead a commodity to be locked away, ensuring that power and profit remained in the hands of a legally protected few. Even in death, a serf could not escape their lord's grasp. The final, crushing obligation was the law of Heriot, a feudal who collected the moment a peasant breathed their last. When a serf died, the lord held the legal right to seize the family's most valuable possession, typically their best beast of burden, the ox or horse that plowed their fields. This was not a tax on wealth, but a tax on existence itself, a final assertion that every ounce of a peasant's labor and every asset they owned ultimately belonged to the manor. Imagine the scene. A family is shrouded in grief, mourning the loss of a parent or a spouse. Into this sorrow steps the Lord's bailiff, his claim cold and absolute. He leads away the prime ox, the very animal that represented the family's ability to feed itself and work its land in the coming year. In a single, lawful act, personal tragedy was compounded by economic catastrophe. The Heriot could plunge a household from precarious subsistence into irreversible destitution. This law reveals the brutal logic of the feudal engine. It was systematically designed to prevent the lower classes from ever accumulating wealth or achieving independence. By legally claiming the most productive asset upon death, the lord ensured that peasant families remained permanently dependent. They could never build a legacy or amass enough capital to break free from the manor's control. The cycle of poverty was not an accident, it was policy. The Heriot starkly illustrates that the lord's power was not just over the land, but over the very tools of survival. He controlled the means of production, and through laws like this, he made certain that those means never stayed in one peasant family for too long. Why enforce such a heartless rule at the moment of a person's death? Because the Heriot was the ultimate expression of the feudal bargain, a chilling reminder that from cradle to grave, and even beyond, every breath and every possession was a loan from the lord, a debt that came due at the very end. A roll of the dice was an act of rebellion. While football was banned for its chaotic crowds, the authorities also turned their gaze inward to the quiet games played in taverns and homes. Medieval laws frequently prohibited a whole host of unlawful games, including dice, cards, and in some remarkable cases, even the strategic game of chess. These were not seen as harmless diversions, but as direct threats to the moral and social fabric. The official reasoning was straightforward. Games of chance like dice were gateways to gambling, debt, and violent disputes. They distracted men from their vital labors in the field or the workshop, but the suspicion of chess is far more revealing. Here was a game that required intense intellect and foresight, yet it too was condemned. Why would a game of pure strategy be deemed dangerous? Because it represented a different kind of idleness. A mental energy spent on a fictional battlefield instead of on prayer, work, or the king's business. This reveals a paternalistic system where the law sought to govern not just your actions, but your very character. The authorities, both church and state, genuinely believed they were responsible for the moral well-being of their subjects. Unstructured leisure was a vacuum they feared would be filled with vice. The famous saying that idleness is the devil's workshop was not just a proverb, it was a guiding principle of governance. The law was used as a tool to discipline the populace, to channel every available ounce of human energy into what the powerful deemed productive. Labor fed the manor, prayer saved the soul, and martial training secured the realm. A game of dice or a long session of chess produced nothing but fleeting pleasure, and in a world obsessed with order and output, that was a luxury the law could not afford. This was social engineering on a grand scale, an attempt to legislate morality itself by outlawing the very concept of frivolous fun. The next time you casually play a game, remember that there was an age when your choice of pastime could have been a criminal act, all because someone in power decided that your free time was not really your own. These 25 strange laws form a single, coherent blueprint for a society built not on freedom, but on control. Every statute, from the Curfew to the Sumptuary Code, was a deliberate thread in a vast legal tapestry designed to make the abstract social order brutally tangible. The law was the tool that stitched hierarchy into the seams of every garment, that carved status into the points of every shoe, and that transformed your neighbors into your legal guardians. This was a world obsessed with legibility, where your place had to be instantly readable at a glance, and with stability, where any change was seen as a dangerous threat. The constant underlying motivation was fear. Fear of the chaos that could erupt from a darkened street, fear of the rebellion that could spark from a well-aimed arrow, and fear of the divine wrath that could follow an unpunished sin. The legal system became the primary mechanism for managing these overwhelming anxieties. It channeled the terror of famine into price controls on bread, the dread of moral decay into bans on dice games, and the panic of unexplained tragedy into the courtroom spectacle of a witch trial. These laws expose a fundamental truth that law is never a neutral arbiter of right and wrong. It is always a reflection of who holds power and what they are most afraid of losing. It is a blueprint carefully drafted by the powerful for the precise world they wish to build and maintain. The medieval world used its legal code to construct a fortress against uncertainty, a rigid structure where every person, animal, and even idea had a legally mandated place. The true legacy of these statutes is not their strangeness, but their stunning effectiveness in revealing how a society uses rules to build its own reality, crafting a cage of order to hold back the terrifying wilderness of chance. Our journey through these 25 peculiar statutes reveals more than just the oddities of a bygone era. It uncovers the deep architecture of an entire civilization, a world built on a foundation of divinely ordained hierarchy and a pervasive fear of chaos. Law was the master tool used to carve this social blueprint into reality, stitching rigid status into the seams of every garment and forging mutual suspicion into a system of communal policing. We have wandered through a landscape where your bedtime, your bread, and even your shoes were matters of legal decree, all in service of a single, overarching goal: control. This was not the control of a police state as we might imagine it, but something far more intimate and all-encompassing. It was a control woven into the very fabric of daily life, a constant, quiet hum of regulation that taught every person their place from the moment they woke to the curfew bells ring. The past is not a simple story of linear progress from barbarism to enlightenment. It is a complex tapestry of different social contracts, each with its own internal logic and its own profound costs for the human spirit. The great legal historian F.W. Maitland observed that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. The collective experience of the Middle Ages, shaped by plague, famine, and a fragile existence, produced a legal code that sought to build a fortress of order against a terrifying wilderness of chance. These laws, however strange they seem, speak to universal human endeavors. They represent our eternal struggle to impose meaning on a random universe, to create structure from chaos, and to find security, even if the price is our own freedom. The echoes of this medieval mindset are still with us. Consider our own debates over surveillance, social media regulation, and public morality. While our methods have changed, the fundamental tension between individual liberty and collective security remains. These ancient statutes hold up a distant mirror, asking us to reflect on the invisible architectures of